The countries most demographically affected are those least able to handle it. And they're very important for U.S. security. So Jordan is the linchpin of U.S. security right now. And it can't handle all of this influx. Lebanon may not be where the U.S. flies its flag the most strongest, but if it goes, that's a domino effect for a lot of other places. We don't want a return of a civil war. So the effects on these countries, first of all, culturally and socially. We have a resurgence in early child marriage. So because refugees are economically insecure and not allowed to work in a lot of these places, what happens is people marry off their daughters early. This is not abnormal in any way for refugees. In fact, one of the main things that refugees do to survive, we find, is often prostitution. So in Syria, when the Iraqi refugees came in, we had a surge in Iraqi women prostituting themselves, often to save their daughters from doing it, we found, and they would rotate and be able to survive that way, with the mothers taking the burden off of their children. So we have early marriage, and people are taking advantage of this. We're getting second marriages in countries where it's not legal. Turkey. Second marriage is not legal while you still have a first wife in Turkey. So off the books, Syrian girls are being married to Turkish men as their second wives. Turkish women clearly do not like this, and they've started to really resent Syrian women. Same thing in Lebanon and Jordan, where second wives are legal, with the added thing that a lot of Gulf people who are rich, men who are rich, come from the Gulf and marry young Syrian wives with the promise that they're going to support the family. So in the Middle East, the husband gives a substantial gift to his wife upon marriage, a mahr. And so the family, the wife, benefits economically. That's hers to use as she will. But in these situations, the family uses it to survive. And if the husband is rich and he says, I'm going to support the family, this is an smart economic decision, and clearly preferable to a lot of other alternatives that people are doing, called negative coping strategies, that include prostitution, drug running, criminal activity, etc., to survive. The problem is that they don't stay married often. So they'll marry her for a month, and then they divorce her, and they leave her there. And promises are not kept, and then the girl is not able to marry in the future for the same amount of gift, because she's no longer a virgin. And this situation's abused. Plus, you get earlier and earlier marriages, and Jordanian women and Lebanese women are not happy with their men having the alternative of a less expensive, in terms of a gift, woman to marry, in their words. So it's causing a lot of resentment. And culturally, that's entering into the population. There's also a change in gender roles. With men being arrested far more frequently if they work, you get more women and children working. Women having to go farther to gain what they need to survive, and being subject to harassment because they're Syrian women and they're working, and this is not the same type of culture. So we do get changes in gender roles. We get a change in gender roles also from a different sort that you may not think of. People think, again, camps are fantastic, all your food is provided for you. And in the beginning, some camps followed the model that they would actually cook all the food for the family. You might think, oh, that's fantastic. So the woman doesn't have to do anything. Great, she doesn't have to cook. In a traditional family, that means she has almost no role. She has almost no worth. So a byproduct of this was a lot of domestic violence. It caused problems in the family. The men didn't have a job and couldn't provide. The women weren't doing anything to contribute to the family in a traditional sense that they had been raised to think is their job. And the men had been raised to think that's her job. And it caused problems between children. We know that providing food is one of the main sources of attachment to a young child with their parents. And when that's taken away, some of the humanitarian organizations saw some problems. And they've since fixed this and it's changed. Now they provide the elements of food and let the families cook for themselves, which is far superior. But these are things you don't think of. I found the humanitarian organizations actually do realize them. And they're a great resource to people wanting to say, hey, you know, does this make sense? It makes sense to me to cook for people. And so they don't have to do anything. But does this really make sense? And they're able to see the other implications that we wouldn't think of. For example, attachment problems with the children. Economically, the Syrians competed somewhat with local labor. It depends on the country and it depends on what type of labor. They competed with lower status labor, particularly construction, agriculture, and in many cases these were done by migrants anyway. So in Jordan, this was done by Egyptian migrants. And mostly the Syrians competed with those Egyptians, not with Jordanians. But we do have Syrians competing with Jordanians and with Lebanese and with Turks. The data is pretty clear that over the long run, migrants, including refugees, help an economy. They boost the economic status of the people who are living there, possibly not in the short term. In Turkey, Syrians pushed the informal labor, was female and low-skilled, out of the informal market. For the men, they pushed them out of the informal market, but pushed them up to the formal market to be paid more. So the men become managers and actually improve their status. And we don't know about the women and the lower skilled. This could be a phenomenon similar to what we saw in this country, in the United States, when blacks started to stay in education longer because they feared their jobs from Mexicans. So they started to actually get more education. We see some of these people who are pushed out of the informal market up their qualifications so they can go to the formal market. That would be a positive long-term trend. We don't know exactly what's happening in Turkey because it's right now happening. In Jordan, we do see people accusing Syrians all the time of taking their jobs. It's not clear how much of that is happening. What is clear is that Syrians are starting jobs. So they're starting businesses. They're very good at food service and restaurants. And you see Syrian restaurants popping up all over the country. In fact, if you ask an upper-class Jordanian, what effect did the Syrians have on your country? What they told me is, now we have good food. Of course, that's upper class, right? So they're not affected. The lower class is. The upper class or the middle class that's educated, they benefited. So how did they benefit? They got jobs with the UN. So the UN and all these humanitarian organizations moved in and they needed local labor. And they hired generally about 89% of their labor is local. So that's all Jordanians, all Lebanese, all Turks. So those middle-class people who have English skills and a college education, they get better jobs and much better pay. Teachers started getting double salary. They had to work double, but they started to get double salary. At least, the UN paid actually much more than locally, in Lebanon at least. So some people benefited. Anybody who owned land or owned an apartment benefited because they could rent out their place for 3 times more than they had previously rented it out to the Syrians. So many Syrian families would live together and they'd be able to pool rent, and they're sort of held hostage. They have to live somewhere. They don't have the option of going home to their parents. So the rental market was able to charge far more. And in the beginning, the humanitarian organizations handed Syrians money. The world felt really guilty. They started just handing them money for rent. And landlords realized that they had all this cash. And they could pile several families into one, and Syrians wouldn't complain because they're refugees. They're fleeing war. They're not going to complain that there are 3 families in a 1-family apartment. So they made money, and the rent prices tripled in some places, quadrupled in others, or just doubled in some places. But they went at least double. If you had to rent an apartment, you lost out. So if you were Jordanian or Lebanese and wanted to rent a place and you didn't own anything, so you lost. So different people gained and different people lost in each economy. Services were stretched, particularly schooling. So not all Syrian refugee children go to school. In fact, about half don't. But imagine 500,000 children coming into a Lebanese system that had only 200,000 to begin with. For the public school system. The private school serves most people in Lebanon. So they come in, they're flooding your classes. Now you're a parent, and your child's class has gone from 20 kids in a class to 50 or 60 kids in a class. You know your kid's not getting the same type of education. So there's a lot of animosity, a lot of anger. The UN eventually moved to a double shifting system. So in the afternoons, they would have a whole nother shift for Syrians. So the teachers would squeeze all their teaching for the local people into the morning and the Syrians into the afternoon. That meant, though, that the teachers are worked double in many cases. You try to hire more teachers, but there's only so many teachers. Or you use the same ones. And then parents are going to complain, well, now my teacher's tired and can't give the same amount of attention to my kid. What if my kid needs extra help after school? This is still ruining our school standards. So we have a lot of animosity about that. Parents really, really, really care about their kids' education. This is one of the main touchstones of problems. Another is the fact that getting to school is actually a problem. Syrians often can't actually get to school. They don't have transportation. And in at least one case that I know of, the school bus drivers formed a bit of what locally they called a mafia. The school bus drivers wouldn't pick up Syrians. They just refused. The effect of the Syrian refugees in these host countries hasn't been all negative. I talked a lot about how they work and start businesses and restaurants. They do tiling and painting and construction. We found that for every dollar the international community spends giving to refugees, it circulates in that host country 2.3 times, essentially creating more money, creating more economic well-being. Soon after the refugee camp Zaatari was set up across the border in Jordan, UN officials started to see Syrians with these weigh scales, the old school weigh scales where you put some weights on and have to make sure they balance to sell fruit and vegetables. These are heavy things. They didn't come running across the border with them. Where'd they buy them? Locally. The Syrians actually increase local retail sales. They buy from the local market. So we have seen that while some people absolutely lose in a host country and some people absolutely win, overall on a macro level, these countries have not done too badly. They've had a couple percentages of growth, 3% growth rate generally in the last few years, even with the refugee burden. There's a lot of money coming in, a lot of reconstruction happening, more fixing up of places for Syrians to live, infrastructure development, long-term water projects, long-term electricity projects, roads, fixing schools, and the international community has come together to do a lot of this. So the UN hopes to leave long-term benefit in the host country. And in some areas, that is absolutely going to be true. Even in some of the best schools in Jordan, for example, where royals go and they send their children, you have serious bullying of Syrian children. And not the light kind of bullying, calling names. This is serious, beating children up. Why is this important? Children are one of the future problems that could occur in these countries. Children who are out of school cannot easily go back to school. The longer they're out of school, the harder it is for them to actually sit in a classroom. So if you get children out of school, you've got an entire generation that's not educated. And they don't have much other option. Children are exposed to conditions working that are going to last and stay with them for a long time. Criminal work, running drugs, doing other work related to the sex industry. It's not pleasant. And yet we're hoping that they're going to reconstruct Syria. But having been exposed to these situations, it's going to be harder and harder for them. Remember that the Islamist organizations often use education as one of their main methods of indoctrination and one of their main draws. They're going to help children go to school, and these children are not going to school. So this is a potential long-term threat to countries around Syria and Syria if these children's conditions are not paid attention to, if they don't start getting educated and protected from bullying. This has long-term psychological effects that we're still learning about. Another problem with children is that babies are often not registered. If they don't get registered in the host countries, then they run the risk of being stateless. Stateless children can't register for school, they can't get jobs, they can't get driver's licenses, they don't exist. It's a huge problem in the world when children become stateless. In 2016, about 40,000 Syrian babies were born. And the Lebanese make every attempt to try to register them. But what if the parents aren't registered? It's very hard to register then the children. Sometimes the parents are afraid from the police, so they don't go to the municipality to register the children. That's a long-term danger. For traditional military security threats, the main ones come not from the Syrian refugees, but from the Syrian civil war itself. So Jordan experienced a lot of infiltration from on the border, and Lebanon did also, and Turkey, as a result of militias acting in the Syrian civil war. Arsal, the border town in Lebanon with Syria, had a lot of Syrian refugees in it. Part of that is because of the Syrian state's policy of not establishing refugee camps. So people just settled right there on the border. Now, refugee studies knows that the worst place to put a lot of refugees is on the border, because it's easy for militants to go back and forth through to them and use them for humanitarian aid, for housing, to hide amongst them. And that's what happened in Arsal. Arsal became a huge security nightmare. The Hezbollah was involved in trying to stop it, along with the Lebanese military. Eventually, the refugees and the militias were escorted out back into Syria. There's been some Islamist militia activity in Lebanon. It's been limited, but there has been some. Militias have tried to cross over and affect Jordan also, and Turkey. So the border towns generally experience some spillover of the civil war. We do have some people in these countries becoming radicalized and going to fight in the Syrian civil war. Jordan had a few thousand, at least, people that went to Syria and came back, fighters that they're trying to deal with now. Other countries haven't given us any figures on how many went, but we know that the Syrian civil war itself has spilled over. The Syrian refugees are generally not a threat of radicalization. There is some in host countries when people want to fight and they leave to go fight. The Syrian refugee program in the United States has brought up a lot of questions on what are the possibilities of so-called Islamic State people coming in through the program, etc. So I want to put that to rest right now. It's very hard to be picked to be a refugee, to be resettled. First, only the most vulnerable, those who have been tortured or are at risk where they are in the host country, are picked. Then they're investigated by the UN multiple times. Only the squeakiest of clean qualify. And then the US does 2 years of investigation to see if that person qualifies to be a refugee. The US has the most stringent refugee qualifications of anyone in the world. We take a long time. All the agencies are involved. It's extremely hard. In 14 years of accepting refugees, the US has taken 750,000. Of those, none have been accused of domestic terrorism, and only 2 have been accused of a potential plot. 2 out of 750,000. Generally, our refugee system works. It vets them quite thoroughly. Candidates for resettlement go through numerous interviews, background checks, check to see if this statement matches that statement, but not too closely. It's very, very hard. Islamist groups have an interest in painting refugees as a danger to the US and to Western nations, because their whole motto is that Muslims and the West can't get along. So they want Muslims to be rejected from the United States. They want to paint them. The best antidote to that is to reject it and show that these refugees can live peacefully, and that we have many, many, many refugees in our country that live peacefully and we welcome them. 2 other important non-traditional security threats are fights over scarce resources and disease and health. The Syrians have overwhelmed medical services in many of these countries, and when they're not registered, they don't go to the doctor. And why is this important? They don't go to the doctor and they live in informal tented settlements, places that are not meant for human residence. They don't have adequate human waste disposal. We start to see diseases pop up. And we have seen, particularly in Lebanon, some diseases amongst Syrian refugees. And we hope that there's not some worse disease that shows up because people are living in very small spaces without the UN facilities and without being registered and without having access to doctors. You want people to immediately go to a doctor if they have a problem. If they don't, because they can't, then you're expanding the radius of those who are potentially affected and possibly it getting out of control. It just takes one person to get on a plane and you're done. This is one potential danger of Syrians not being registered and so not having access to health care, living in particularly bad situations. Another is the fight over scarce resources and connected to that, effects on the environment. Jordan is one of the most water-scarce countries in the world. Syrians have entered and They have used water that pretty much doesn't exist in Jordan. And Jordan is even more water scarce than it was. There's been fights over water between Jordanians and Syrians, and between Jordanians and the Jordanian government and security services. Violent fights. So it's quite serious. Towns have had no water. Water shut off for quite a long time and no access to water. Lebanon's water and electricity have been affected. Electricity more so in Lebanon because it has a vibrant private sector water delivery system. But those have also been taxed. And in Lebanon, because the camps are not formal, they're informal tented settlements instead, they're not formal, and the UN can't provide for them, human waste has begun infecting the underground water supply. And this is also a potential serious long-term problem. Again, related to the country's policies, that they don't want to establish permanent residences, but the waste is then infecting the underground water. And that doesn't just stop in Lebanon. That water supply doesn't know anything about national boundaries. So it crosses national boundaries. When you've infected an environment and altered environmental factors, there's no national involved. It affects everybody in the region. And these are some of the long-term, non-traditional security threats that we worry about. Resource scarcity and fights over scarce resources, and disease and infection and contamination of the environment, I should say. So one thing we're unsure of is the effect of many of the non-UN charities that have come in to help the Syrian refugees. Immediately after the Syrian civil war started and the refugee crisis began, charities from the Gulf started to come in to help the refugees. These are unregulated. We don't know what they do. We don't know who they give money to. They are not registered with anybody. The UN has no idea or influence on who they give money to or what they do. So this is a big unknown. We do have information that they tend to give their money through mosque networks and through imams. So this could be a long-term problem in solidifying more Gulf versions of Islamism amongst the Syrian population. That could be a problem, we don't know. One of the traditional security risks of Syrian refugees is the potential for radicalization or working with some of the militias. We don't have many cases of this, to be honest. And where we do, when they've been interviewed or interviewed upon returning, we find out that many of them are working. They feel like they just have to earn money to feed their families and keep them safe. So they're basically using militias as a job. And those are the more Islamist, richer militias. And they know they're going to die, probably. And they say, well, I have to do it for my family. So this tells us two things. First, it's related to the policy of the country of whether they can work or not. Second, they're not becoming radicalized for the love of radicalization. They're doing it as a job. And there's a policy opportunity for us to step in and provide work and probably less long-term danger amongst that population.